This is what it feels like.
Hey y'all, playing you the greatest hit from Southeast Asia all day, every day. Only here at 97.52 FM. This is Mr. Cole here with you, and today's topic we have Konfrontasi. Okay guys, welcome to the next series of lectures on the interstate conflict in Southeast Asia. After that brilliant intro, I really don't know how I'm going to top this up, and I think everything is going to go downhill from here, but I'll try to keep things interesting. Now, our next conflict that we have as a case study is Konfrontasi. The primary disputants in this conflict are Indonesia and Malaysia, although other countries like Singapore, the North Borneo territories, as well as Brunei are involved as well. Now, due to the colonial linkages and the Cold War, external powers were also indirectly drawn into this conflict. We have the British, we have the US, even from the Soviet side, we have the USSR and Communist China as well. So this just goes to show you, or at least give you a taste of what this conflict is like. It started out as a bilateral conflict, but by the end of it, so many different powers were involved, and it just gives you a taste of what's to come. I think one of the key questions we want to ask ourselves is, why did this conflict even take place initially, and how did it get so escalated? Compared to Sabah, I think for Sabah we saw that Marcos had initiated some covert action revealed in the Corregidor affair, through Operation Merdeka and all that. And in this case, we are going to see a lot more of that. Konfrontasi in itself as a period only lasted for about 2 to 3 years. But within these 2 to 3 years, there was so much infiltration, there was so much military action, there was so many covert operations, so much belligerence and aggression from one country to the other within this short spans of time. And one of the key questions, once again, is to ask ourselves, why did this conflict arise in the first place? Why did it prolong? Why did it escalate? Going down to the basics of things, we are asking for the causes and for the nature of this conflict. You can see on the slide right here, the quotation from Sukarno himself, "Our struggle is not yet finished." And this audio recording is quite a struggle for me. This is like the 2 billionth time I'm trying to record this thing. So hopefully this time it goes well. Now, going back to our syllabus objectives, we want to look at the causes and the nature of interstate tensions. We want to look at the causal factors that help develop these interstate tensions into full-blown conflicts. And just as what we looked at in Sabah, we are going to see many different dimensions of conflict here as well. Your job is to identify these dimensions of conflict and also ascertain and evaluate the relative importance of one dimension over the other, one causal factor over the other. You can see that when we did the Sabah conflict, we looked at many different dimensions, what could have possibly caused and prolonged the conflict: sovereignty, security, the role of individual leaders, national pride, as well as domestic factors. And actually, in Konfrontasi, our next case study, you will see such similar dimensions of conflict as well. And I think the key thing to keep in mind once again is to really ask ourselves, relative importance, what was the cause of this conflict? What kind of consequences did it produce as well? Now, if we go into the timeline of the conflict, I always find it useful to look at the key points, to look at how the conflict developed across time. So you could mount an argument possibly that, the conflict started because of a certain dimension of the causal factor, let's say sovereignty, but it evolved into something different across time because of the introduction of certain actions or events. And if you take a look at this timeline, maybe we can actually posit that kind of trajectory for Konfrontasi as well. If you go to the start of the timeline, you see that in 1955, Indonesia moves into the period of guided democracy under President Sukarno. Now, in this conflict, the role of the leader plays a huge part. His personality, his inclinations, his agenda, his conceptualizations, his nationalism, all these play a part in producing this crisis. They definitely play a part in his dedicated policy of confrontation against Malaysia. At that point in time, contemporarily speaking, this whole period of time was called the Crush Malaysia campaign. You can't get more overt, you can't get more evident than that of what his intentions are, which is to crush Malaysia. By 1955, if you remember from Team 1, your notes, by this point in time, Sukarno has already maneuvered himself into a huge position of influence in Indonesian politics itself. So in this case, when it comes to matters of foreign policy, Sukarno would have a heavy hand to play in whatever Indonesia or however Indonesia chooses to interact with its neighbors or with any other country in the world. And his own biases, his own inclinations, his own agenda would definitely figure into the foreign policy of in Indonesia. Now, another dimension of conflict, we see this quite early on, is this whole idea of sovereignty. If you look at the headings of 1961 going on to 1962, I think initially one of the biggest contestations in Konfrontasi was about sovereignty and whether the wishes of the people, especially of the North Borneo territories, whether the wishes of these people were ascertained and genuinely solicited, whether or not they wanted to join this new federation called Malaysia. So that's what I mean by when I say that at the start of the conflict, it may have been about something, in this case sovereignty, that's that dimension of the conflict. But as it progressed and as it evolved, certain other elements come into play. Now, what are these other elements? You can see that from the middle of the time frame all the way actually towards the end, there is a lot of military referencing. There is a lot of military action from one party to the other. And what we can then see is this very dominating security crisis or this very dominating security concern on the part of both Malaysia and Indonesia, actually, even though Indonesia was seen as the aggressor in this case. And then all the way towards the end, you can see that on 30th September, there was a coup against Sukarno. And interestingly enough, when the new leader, Suharto, assumed the presidency, this whole confrontation was actually just dropped. Just like that. And it just maybe gives a bit of credence to the argument that maybe this whole conflict was down to leadership and how they chose to manage interstate tensions. In this case, how Sukarno provoked the escalation of interstate tensions between Indonesia and Malaysia. Now, going into the dimensions of conflict, the causes, the nature of the conflict between Indonesia and Malaysia. Once again, let's try to specify the different dimensions. The first one I would like to talk about is this idea of sovereignty. And it has come up in Sabah, and so too it will come up again here. Now, for Indonesia and for Sukarno actually, there is this conception of what we call Indonesia Raya. Loosely translated, it means Greater Indonesia. So what does this really mean? It means that this country, this nation, and the leader himself has a conception of Indonesian dominance in the Malay archipelago in Southeast Asia. So there's this idea of Indonesia needing to take the leadership in the Malay world, in Southeast Asia, this idea of Indonesia needing to assert its dominance and to assert its leadership over the different countries, in this case, the countries of the Malay archipelago. Now, the problem comes in when the Federation of Malaysia is formed. Now, the Federation of Malaysia is going to be a sovereign nation. is going to be a sovereign entity, is going to be independent. Now, what that means is that by the principle of sovereignty, Indonesia has lost this opportunity, or is going to lose this opportunity of asserting its dominance over Malaysia, because at the end of the day, it has to respect the principle of sovereignty. The Federation of Malaysia, this plan and this new independent country, is a spanner in the works of what Sukarno and Indonesia has planned for their dominance of the region. Now, this Federation of Malaysia is not small, because it's going to consist a number of former colonial territories. So you have Malaya, you have Singapore, Sabah, Sarawak, and initially there was this idea that Brunei was also supposed to be part of this federation. You can see immediately that any plans for the Indonesia Raya or Greater Indonesia, any conceptualizations of that has, by this scheme, entirely collapsed. This whole Indonesia Raya can no longer happen because of this new federation of Malaysia. So in this case, I think it will be classified as a sovereignty issue, because this is about contestation of territory, or at least the contestation of the conceptualizations of territory, where they see their natural boundaries, and that comes into conflict with the legal boundaries that are going to come into play with the Federation of Malaysia. So there is still some sort of contestation going on over there as to how far the national boundaries can extend towards to. Indonesia has their own conceptualizations based on ethnicity. This idea of the Malay world being under the dominant leadership of Indonesia. But that runs counter to Malaysia's own nationalist aspirations and Malaysia's own declared sovereignty. So there comes the contest between the two. Aside from that, there's also another sovereignty issue, but this time it has to do with the peoples of North Borneo and Sarawak. There was the accusation that when they were solicited for their views as to whether they wanted to join the new Malaysia Federation, the soliciting, the referendum or the plebiscite itself was not authentic, and it wasn't representative of the population. There wasn't a popular kind of indication of whether or not the peoples of these territories wanted to join Malaysia. And there was the accusation from Indonesia that these territories were manipulated into joining Malaysia, or were coerced into joining Malaysia. Whatever the case that was, this idea of sovereignty creeps up once again, because you don't really, or from Indonesia's point of view, there isn't a legitimate ascertaining of the views of these people, and therefore sovereignty cannot immediately and automatically be transferred into this new federation of Malaysia. So they demanded for a referendum on a popular basis to be given to these people before any decision was made for them to join the new federation of Malaysia. The problem with this is that I don't think Indonesia was also truly genuine about wanting to push forth this referendum idea. I think they were just trying to delay time in order to further attack this idea of Malaysia. They just wanted to delay the formation of it, and this was one of the tactics that I think they were trying to strategize with. So over here we have the map. As what I mentioned just now, we have this idea of Greater Indonesia. You can see it in red over here, and it covers a huge part of island Southeast Asia, the Malay archipelago. You can see that it extends to territories like Malaya, Singapore, Brunei, Sabah, Sarawak, the Celebes, West Guinea as well. So this is his idea, and this is his territorial conception of what Indonesia could be or should be. And this ran counter with the declared Federation of Malaysia and its own sovereign independent status. Okay, now, as mentioned earlier, we may identify a certain dimension or certain cause of the conflict as the initial trigger or the initial instigator of the conflict. But as time goes on, as the conflict moves on, the dimensions of the conflict might evolve. They might be compounded by new dimensions, by new factors, by new events, by new players. Now, one of the big things about confrontasi, it actually, as its name suggests, confrontation, there's definitely going to be some sort of security element to this conflict. Now, much of this dimension is intertwined with the figure of Sukarno. As I said, his conceptualizations, ambition, agenda, strategy, his own personality and his own inclinations. Now, he had this very firm belief that Malaysia was what we call a neo-colonial plot that threatened the security of Indonesia. Now, what is a neo-colonial plot or what is a neo-colonial situation? It basically means that, okay, yes, although Britain has decolonized Malaya and Singapore and whatever, they are still exerting their influence in the country in indirect or subtle ways, or sometimes even manifested ways. Now, why is this a security concern? Why is there this security element to this neo-colonialism? It's because of the presence of British military troops, aircraft, and naval vessels in Malaysia and Singapore. Now, Sukarno is very, very cautious about this situation because his idea is that, look, if you have achieved independence, if you have attained independence, you should rid yourselves of the yoke of colonialism. You should try to remove all vestiges of Western imperial rule in your country. Now, the presence of these military men and hardware continuing to stay and remain in these territories poses a huge problem to independence because in his idea, that's not true independence. The sovereignty is not yours, it's not Malaysia's. Britain is still exerting its colonial influence in Malaysia and Singapore. Now, he senses this threat perception because Sukarno himself, he's fiercely nationalistic, he's fiercely anti-imperial, and immediately he equates the two and he presents a security threat perception to Indonesia because of this neo-colonial plot. Now, part of this anti-imperial kind of stance from Sukarno is a very, very hard resolve to remove all vestiges of colonialism in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia as a whole. Now, he's going to continue to try to achieve this agenda. Now, particularly in this case study of West Irian, when the Dutch decolonized Indonesia, actually West Irian was sort of in a very, it was in a mess, and sovereignty had not fully been transferred over to Indonesia. Now, long story short, Sukarno continued to fight for West Irian. Diplomatically speaking, it went to the UN and all that. And at the end of the day, the Dutch were forced to relinquish control of West Irian to Indonesia. So Sukarno got West Irian back and incorporated it into the nation of Indonesia. Now, why is this relevant to Konfrontasi? Is because this further strengthens his resolve to continue to fight against all semblances of imperialism in Southeast Asia. He is a very he's a huge nationalist in this sense, and he's actually also quite a regionalist in the sense that he wants to maintain the independence and the sovereignty and the rights of all Southeast Asians. He sees Indonesia as a leader in that crusade against the last vestiges of colonialism. Part of this is his idea of external powers shouldn't interfere in the affairs of the nation. External powers shouldn't interfere in the affairs of the region. He is a huge proponent of this stance called non-alignment. Basically, in the Cold War, you're either pro-democracy or you're pro-communist, and you fall into either one of those two camps. That's bipolarity for you. But non-alignment, Sukarno is saying that, look, we don't really want to be part of these superpower politics or this superpower zero-sum game. We, as ourselves, as a region, as a nation, we can have a third choice, and this third choice is non-alignment. And non-alignment is just another form of his very anti-imperialist kind of stance. He doesn't want Indonesia, or he doesn't want Southeast Asia to be continually used as proxies by larger powers. He wants this idea of non-interference. He wants Southeast Asians to be free from all these kind of bondages and chains. And the last point I have for you for this security dimension is, like what I mentioned earlier, although Konfrontasi was only for 2 years or 2 to 3 years, there was a lot of military action going on within those 2 to 3 years. And it's not, just standoffs. There was actually conflict involved. There was blatant infringement of territories by the dropping of paratroopers, or there was naval skirmishes between vessels, things like that. So definitely the security element is huge in this. I think the one that we are most familiar with is the bombing of the McDonald House in Singapore, where 2 Indonesian Marines infiltrated our territory and planted time bombs in the McDonald House as an act of terrorism, as an act of resistance against this Malaysian Federation. Just to give you some examples of this security dimension to the conflict, we have, I'm just going to give you 2, but there are plenty more. The landing at Labis on 2nd September 1964, where there was an airborne landing by Indonesian paratroopers near Labis, Johor, Malaysia. So you can see by dropping foreign military troops into another territory, into another country, that causes huge problems because, number one, you're infringing sovereignty, and you're not just dropping any civilians or whatever. You're dropping military men, and 102 of that. So that immediately poses a huge security risk. That immediately escalates the conflict to another level. It wasn't an easy task for the Malaysian authorities, and with the help of the British, they took a month to round up 98 of those troops that were dropped in Labis. 32 were killed, 62 were captured. The other one, as I already mentioned, is the McDonald House bombing on 10th March 1965. You can see that the bombing itself was quite problematic. Once again, these are Marines, Indonesian Marines, which means that they are sent from the National Army of Indonesia, which means that the state, the government, the president himself would definitely have some sort of connection to this. The explosion killed 3 people, injured 33, so definitely there's this security threat. And because of the severity of this threat and the consequences of it, it definitely escalated the situation. The 2 saboteurs were actually convicted and hanged. They were killed in 1968. And actually, after the dispute had ended, even after Konfrontasi had ended, this McDonald House bombing continued to pose problems for the bilateral relationship between Singapore and Malaysia. When Suharto came into power, he pleaded for clemency for those 2 Marines, but the Lee Kuan Yew government wasn't really having it, and they continued to proceed with their capital punishment. And that soured the bilateral relationship for a long period of time until Lee Kuan Yew himself had to go down to Indonesia to pay the respects to those 2 Indonesian Marines. And after that, the relationship between Indonesia and Singapore improved a lot to what it is today. The last dimension that I want to bring up in this conflict of Konfrontasi is that of motivations from the domestic political scene in Indonesia itself. Now, the economic situation under guided economy was not doing very well. As I mentioned, Sukarno, by this point in time, he was already fully entrenched in authoritarian style of governance through guided democracy. And the economic counterpart to guided democracy is guided economy. Now, the issue with guided economy, I think for now you can just know that things weren't going very well. The targets weren't being met. The economy was moving into a state of inflation. The health was deteriorating, and poverty, misery, all those kind of stuff. So it basically wasn't going very well for the economy in Indonesia itself. What leaders usually do in these kind of situations is to try to provide some sort of distraction for the population to turn their gaze towards to. Usually this kind of distraction would come in the area of foreign policy, where you can create a sort of an enemy or a threat in another country and divert your attention away from your own domestic political situation or economic situation. So this could also have been one of the motivations for konfrontasi from the Indonesian perspective. Now, furthermore, I think with the West Irian campaign, long story short, it was a costly campaign, and it further compounded on the miseries of the economy in Indonesia. So aside from their own general economic problems pertaining to their policy strategies and the kind of output and productivity they had, there were also other campaigns and events that cost them money, and that further compounded the economic situation. So konfrontasi could be seen as a strategy to distract the population from the magnitude of the domestic issues. And besides the economy, another significant faction or another significant player in the domestic scene at this point in time is the PKI. The PKI are the communists. Now, under Sukarno's power structure, he has utilized and incorporated both the communists and the military as part of his power structure. So definitely, because he relies on the communists, and in turn the communists also rely on him, but in this case, because he relies on the communists, definitely he has to take their views or their ambitions or their kind of agenda into account. Now, the PKI communists has always placed pressure on Sukarno to pivot to the communist camp. Just now I mentioned that Sukarno he has outrightly stated the policy of non-alignment and his very fervent desire not to be manipulated or be used by external powers. But that could be the rhetoric, but in reality and on a practical level, I don't think he fully committed to that as well. Because of the pressure from the PKI communists and maybe because of his own inclinations as well, he did actually play both sides of the conflict. He did lean towards certain communist countries, the USSR no less. And because of that, he wanted to upplay this idea of Malaysia as a neo-colonial plot. He even brought in the idea that the US is part of this neo-colonial plot. Trying to position this once again as a Cold War bipolar kind of battle, and he is the moral crusader trying to lead the region towards genuine independence or something to that effect. But I think the basic point here is that the PKI communists could have also been a reason for Indonesia and Sukarno wanting to launch confrontation against Malaysia to fulfill this kind of pseudo Cold War agenda in a sense, but more related to the domestic sphere. So now, as this is a source-based activity, I thought it would be nice to look at how these dimensions of conflict actually manifested itself at that point in time. There are many documents out there for this dispute konfrontasi, but I just wanted to zoom in on one, which is proceedings in the United Nations Security Council on the 9th and 14th of September 1964. So this is about 1 year plus into the conflict already, and it's about 1 year plus away from the final resolution of the conflict. I just picked out certain quotations, certain sources for you to look at in order to see the contemporary view of the situation. What were the dominating concerns? What were the dominating views and contestations between the nations in this conflict at that point in time? So let's take a look at them. The first one is by Dato Ismail, Malaysian Minister for Home Affairs. Indonesian paratroop operation at Labis and produce from. Okay, so basically what he's doing over here is this is him. This is a source describing his actions. He is talking about that paratrooper operation at Labis, and in the UNSC, he from a sack, I guess a gunny sack or whatever, he takes out Indonesian war material, including a 52mm mortar, automatic rifle, a parachute, a camouflage uniform, a helmet, other military equipment. I guess these are things from that were captured from the paratroopers. And at this point, the chairman of the UNSC, Mr. Morozov of the USSR, ordered the sacks and equipment to be removed from the room before the Malaysian representative was allowed to continue his statement. So, just from this paragraph alone, this quotation alone, we can see that definitely there's a security military element to it. We can see that what Malaysia is focused on at this point in time is the infringement of their sovereignty and the security threat that these Indonesian paratroopers have posed to the nation. And that could be a source of the escalation of tensions. That could be the cause of why they convened this very special meeting in the first place. The second thing we can look at this and we can indirectly point out is looking at the reaction from the Soviet Union. This is the chairman of the UNSC at this point in time, Mr. Morozov. He orders the sacks and equipment to be removed from the room before a Malaysian representative can be allowed to continue his statement. So, I don't know, that seems to suggest some sort of Cold War politics at play here. There's some sort of alignment because it seems like the big brother, the Soviet Union right now is trying to, if not protect, at least mitigate the effects of what this Malaysian minister is accusing Indonesia of. So definitely I think there's some sort of external involvement, Cold War politics going on over here. This next one is from the Indonesian Perspective, Dr. Sujaro. He reiterated that Indonesia did not recognize the Malaysian Federation, so maybe something to do with sovereignty. He described as the creation of British colonialists. So once again, that neo-colonial plot, that security threat perception, that continued infringement of independent Malaysian sovereignty appears once again. He alleged that there has been more than a score of British air incursions over Indonesian Borneo in 62, 63, and 64. So even from the Malaysian and British side, there have also been infringements of sovereignty on their part. And this leads to a huge question. Was Indonesia justified in their security fears? Was Indonesia justified in their policy of confrontation? Because it seems to me that both sides were posing security risks to one another, and both sides were also infringing each other's sovereignty through military action. So, taking a balanced view to this, or at least trying to understand the Indonesian perspective, can we provide some sort of justification to confrontation? Was there a method to Sukarno's madness? Going back to the source, that a British plane had machine gunned an Indonesian patrol in Indonesian territory in 3rd November 1963, that the British personnel had violated Indonesian territory on various dates. So you see, all this kind of military action, that is their justification, that is their idea that, look, it's not just all on our part, you are posing a security risk to us as well. So here he is again. He did not deny that Indonesian volunteers and guerrillas had been fighting in Malaya for some time. I think this is completely a fabrication. Volunteers and guerrillas, later on it was proven that these troops that were sent, the incursions, the planes, the vessels, they are all part of the Indonesian national force, the national military force. So to try to disguise it as volunteers and guerrillas, it was an attempt to try to distance themselves away from the actions, these incursions. But this was to help their brothers in the fight for freedom. And the problem of Malaysia had to be considered in the context of a deeper and broader conflict that between the new emerging countries and the remnants of colonialism. So I think this dude, he's pretty consistent with his viewing of what this whole conflict is about and why this whole idea of Malaysia is not tenable, and it's, I guess, to him, revolting. This is the chairman of the UNSC at that point in time, USSR, Mr. Platon Morozov. He upheld the Indonesian view. So again, once again, that kind of alignment there, that Britain bore the major responsibility for the situation by creating the so-called Federation of Malaysia, in order to preserve British colonialist domination in Southeast Asia. Stated that the USA was the leader in the chain of criminal acts of the colonialists in Southeast Asia. So you can see the Cold War frame is definitely here. There is definitely some sort of agency and some sort of agenda on the part of what the USSR is trying to do at this point in time. But basically what he does is also to echo the views of Sukarno, because he is also pointing towards this idea of continued domination, continued neocolonialism in Southeast Asia through this formation of Malaysia. This is the reply from Datuk Ismail. As a sovereign state, he emphasized Malaysia had the right to enter into a military alliance with another country. That's true. Faced with the actual use of force by Indonesia, it had entered into a military agreement with Britain, which was for defensive purposes only. So he's trying to defend his actions as well. He's saying that, look, we are not the aggressors, we are the victims, we are only trying to defend ourselves. So once again, that security threat element over there, which could be terminated when the threat to Malaysia no longer existed. This is a very, very sharp reference to Indonesian aggressive action. The danger threatening Malaysia was not colonialism, as alleged by the Indonesian and Soviet representatives, but the neo-imperialism of a big brother, a big neighbor, whose avowed purpose is to crush Malaysia. The neo-imperialism of a big neighbor. So the Malaysians can also perceive that the Indonesians are trying to assert themselves in some way like a colonial power, or like the very superpowers that Indonesia is condemning. Because if you remember, we can reference back to this idea of Indonesia Raya and the Indonesian conception of their dominance in the Malay archipelago. So Malaysia can also sense that security threat because of Indonesian assertiveness of their dominance in the archipelago, and that resultant threat perception produces this security crisis. The final conclusion from these proceedings, the Norwegian delegate presented a resolution on 15 Sep, which in effect specifically placed the blame on Indonesia for the Labis parachute operation and called upon both countries to refrain from threats or acts of violence and to enter into negotiations. The Norwegian resolution received 9 votes in favor and 2 against. But the Soviets negatived it through their veto, so the entire thing, collapsed. The other party that voted was Czechoslovakia, which once again talks to you about Cold War alignments. Following the Indonesian landings and infiltration attempts during December 1964, it was announced in KL 4th Jan 65 after an emergency meeting of the cabinet that the Malaysian government had decided to ask the United Nations for assistance and to request Malaysia's allies to review the position, blah, blah, blah. So you can see that there was no signs of stopping. In fact, the fact that they had to turn to these external organizations or these external powers for military support suggests that this conflict had entirely changed a dimension, one that was perhaps at the start due to sovereignty, but now maybe evolved into some sort of security conflict. The fact that it has to turn to external organizations suggests the level of severity of this issue, that Malaysia alone could not handle the issue, or at least Malaysia was trying to get powers on their side to serve as a deterrent, something like that. But regardless the case, I think that we can see the security element is quite pronounced over here. And the last slide I have for you is concerning the leadership change. On your left, you have Sukarno, and on the right, you have Suharto. when Suharto launched the coup of 1965 against Sukarno, and Sukarno subsequently diminished in his influence and power, and eventually, left politics entirely. This whole idea of confrontation was actually quite immediately and quite rapidly dropped with the new leadership in Indonesia. Suharto understood the costs that were involved in confrontation, the economic costs. And he also understood that in the long run, he needed to establish good ties with his neighbors and the regional players. So what happened was that the entire policy of confrontation was subsequently dropped, and the conflict was resolved because of this leadership transition. The important point here to note is that when it comes down to if it comes down to that, then was this conflict really about leadership and the kind of choices, the kind of strategies that the leader made in aggravating or in instigating the conflict in the first place? The evidence is here to show that when the leadership changed, the entire strategy changed and the conflict basically dissipated. So that's something for you guys to think about. I presented to you 3 dimensions today, one on sovereignty, one on security and the human agent, and the last one on the domestic issues. So take some time to think about it, try to do some sort of complex web of causal relationships, just like you have done in the past. And I'll be giving you the Konfrontasi SBQ the next time that I see you. Okay? Thanks, guys. This was really awkward.